Okay, it's officially 1 minute past 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to wherever you may be listening in from around the globe. My name is Steve Hoffman with GTN Global Tax Network. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Respond to the New Short-Term Remote Worker. Today's webinar is brought to you by Alliant Employee Benefit Services, GTN Global Tax Network, and Littler Mendelson. This is the second webinar of a three-part webinar series. The first one we did on February 17th, our focus was on the long-term remote worker. If you missed that webinar or would like to listen to it again, it is available on our website. The link is right there, but you can also just go to our resources tab, where in addition to all of our past webinars, we have a tremendous amount of other helpful information like checklists, blogs, and newsletters and webcasts. And if you haven't had an opportunity yet to sign up for our newsletter, I highly recommend it. It's the best way we can keep you informed with new developments in mobility tax as well as other industry information. And it's just a great way to keep you abreast of other webinars that we're doing in the future. So highly recommend it. And if you did sign up and you aren't receiving these emails, check your spam folder. Guarantee it's in there. So today's webinar is the focus on the short-term worker, and then we're finishing it up on April 28th. Where we will have we'll focus on commuters. All right, so logistics. So all attendees are as usual and are muted. And if you'd like to ask a question to any one of our panelists, please use the question feature or the chat box, and we'll respond to them and get to as many as we can. We will be going over scenarios that we have prepared prior to this. We'll go through as many as we can, but we will then shift the focus to the questions that we get from the audience. As usual, this is good for continuing education credits. A big thank you to our friends over at UOC Mortgage for sponsoring the CRP and GMS designations. This is good for 1 credit for the live version and the recorded version. So the live seminar ID is 16496. Again, that's 16496. The recorded version is 16498. 16498. And our friends over at Quicken Loans were kind enough to sponsor us for SHRM and HRCI credits. So the activity ID for SHRM is 21-EV2XQ. Again, that's 21-EV2XQ. And then the HRCI credit is activity ID is 554436. Again, that's 554436. Important note about the HRCI credit, it is still pending approval. We're hoping it'll be approved later today. We expect that the latest will be approved on Monday. So just be aware of that if you're submitting these credits. Just you might want to wait till Monday just to make sure it is official. And then the agenda. Well, the agenda is I'm going to pull up these panelists and have them introduce themselves. So at this point in time, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and ask our esteemed panelists to start sharing their webcams.
Let me see, am I first? Yes, I did. I beat you, David. I beat you, Kay. I did it. First, I was there with the button, just waiting for you to say, Steve, to go.
Well, then I will go.
And Trent's in Singapore. Yeah. Here comes Daddy's last again. You have an excuse.
Well, welcome. And we're going to just ask, I'm going to go down the line here and start with Richard and ask to introduce himself, and then we'll go down from there.
All right. You said to Richard, I should start?
Yes, Richard, you were on first. You were so excited.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm a senior global advisor for Alliant. We specialize in global benefits, HR, all issues relating to expanding internationally. And I've been in the business for, I'm happy to say, 44 years. Doing this wonderful work because every day is something new and it's so much fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. All right, David, to you.
Yeah, David Livett. I'm a national practice leader at Global Tax Network, or GTN. I've got more than 20 years experience now in mobility, and a bit like Richard, absolutely love it. I think every day is a different problem. It's great to be solving them. So happy to be here.
All right, thank you, David. Kay Kolakowski.
Yes, hi everyone. Kay Kolakowski with Aviva. I'm the Global Mobility and Immigration Manager. I've been with the company for about 2 years, but like my esteemed panelist in the industry for over 20 years, doing many different things. I love it, and I can't see myself doing anything else.
Thank you, Kay. And last but not least, all the way from Singapore, Trent.
Yes, I'm Trent Sutton. I'm a lawyer at Littler Mendelson. I've been practicing almost 18 years now, and spend a lot of time on remote work and international, multinational employment issues and compliance. So this is a fun area to be talking about.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for being here. Just as an FYI to everybody, Richard is out of the Los Angeles area. David is out of the New York City area and on the New Jersey side, and Kay's out of Chicago, and I'm out of the Boston area. So we got it covered pretty well globally today. So just kick things off, I am going to read over some scenarios, and I'm going to ask everyone to offer their insights given their field of expertise. The first one, I'm going to start with Trent, and I'm going to go down from there. So the first scenario is this. Juan has been based in Dallas for the last 3 years. She has been working remotely from her home office in Texas since the pandemic began. But the company allowed her to go to China for the last few weeks to visit family. Now the offices are reopening, and Juan contacts HR to say that she cannot return to the office because travel is so challenging, and she wants to stay a few more months in China. The client has no entity in China. What do we do, Trent?
That's a great question. So I think today's program is really focusing on the short-term worker, the short-term remote worker. And the good news is she told you, and you actually know she's out there. So we get to start by planning a little bit what to do from here. And I think that, you know, David and Richard are going to talk about some of the tax and insurance issues that arise here. On the employment side, generally speaking, you've always got to start from the premise of place of employment, because the place of employment governs all of the employment entitlements. And unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule as to what the place of employment is. So in this case, we have somebody who's been working from Houston. We would say she's been there for, let's say she's been there for 3 years. We think clearly her place of employment is Houston. What does that mean? That means for the company that she is subject to Houston and Texas employment laws, wage requirements, such as when you have to pay her and how often you have to pay her. She's subject to US anti-discrimination protection. She's subject to at-will employment doctrine, probably, unless her contract says otherwise. So if I'm a US-based company, I'm thinking, oh, sure, you're in China for a short period of time. That's okay. We'll just keep asserting our Houston annual leave and all of those other things we do for all of our other US employees. In the short term, arguably, these issues may not create significant amount of risks, but they are worth sort of protecting or hedging your bets a bit. Because when you think about place of employment, in this case, she's already been there a few months, right? We don't know how much longer she's going to be there. And the place of employment can change. So if you think about it, I know a lot of our attendees today are US based. If you think about it in the reverse, and you've got a Brazilian employee working out of Houston and they've been in Houston for 6 months, started there for 2 months or 3 months or 5 months now, and she gets sexually harassed and goes to the Texas courts and says, I want to sue under sexual harassment laws in Texas, you'd be hard pressed to find a US court say, agree to the argument that, oh, no, she's a Brazilian employee, so only Brazil law applies to her. And now suddenly that Brazilian company is trying to figure out, oh crap, what's the US sexual harassment laws? So in this situation, the question really becomes one for the company for employment. Where is she asking to work? How long is this going to be there? And we'll talk through, as this goes on, some of the strategies that they can use when you get these kinds of requests. But at a high level, and then of course I'll turn it back over, the good news is China, for purposes of employment law, is actually one of the easier jurisdictions, in that if you don't have a company onshore, most of the time Chinese employment law won't apply to that employer and or that employee, as long as you can show that they have a US based or foreign employment contract and the period of time is relatively short. So in this case, to the employer, for a relatively short period, we're talking maybe a few months-ish, even a little bit longer. In China, unlike other locations, you're probably going to have a much lower risk.
Okay. Thank you for that input. I'm going to get Kay's thoughts on this scenario.
Yeah, that's a great scenario, and thanks, Trent, for that information. And I think when I first saw that scenario and thought it through, my first reactions are, number one, we don't have a legal entity in China, so that can create a permanent establishment. So for us, it's all about what the risk the company is willing to take. So I would involve our legal counsel internally, as well as reach out to our tax provider, because just like you said, you don't know how long that employee plans on being there. Second of all, does that employee's current medical coverage cover them in China should something happen to them? I'm going to wager to say likely not if it's US based. Our company does have international medical coverage, but that's for our expat assignee population that we knowingly place them on when they go on assignment. This is a case where an employee traveled on their own, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And so also, again, we'd want to bring that to the attention of our internal legal counsel as well as our tax provider to see what ramifications and implications to us and the employee may exist. So we would take a strong look at that right away.
So even though they said a few months, you're saying that some employees might stay longer, even though they say one thing, they might do another?
That has been known to happen, and I've chatted with other colleagues and other companies. Some may be on this call today, and I think a lot of us have kind of experienced this as part of this whole pandemic scenario, where sometimes the employee has not gone to their manager and just kind of up and left on their own and traveled, and all of a sudden they tell someone they're in a different location, or else a manager may have approved it, not telling HR or someone else. So there's all kind of scenarios out there. But then as soon as they've kind of come my way or to mobility's attention, we kind of raise that red flag to say, okay, what about legal? What about tax? Those are usually, and immigration in many cases too.
All right. Well, that's a good lead into tax. We'll go to David to get his thoughts.
Thanks, Steve. And yeah, that's is certainly a very interesting scenario. And I think this is one of the sort of headaches that this sort of new, or not new, but this sort of accelerated way of working is causing, is that sort of longer term we did last time, it's a little bit clearer cut. You're actually relocating someone. Most companies are sort of having a sort of up to a certain amount of days, mostly 30, before anything too much is done. But this group is the real headache group, I think. And I was thinking, actually, I'll give you a great tax answer, which I'll probably come on to in a minute, but I just thought about what I do. What do I do in my head that might help people sort of overcome some of the questions and hurdles of this? And I just normally start with a timeline, just a timeline, and start, where are they before, where are they now, and what's the future? Where are they going to be in X period of time? And then overlay that with corporate tax, employer taxes, so payroll, and then ultimately, what's the individual got to do? So if you start to build that sort of framework in your mind, I think you can go through, and this is very selfish, sorry, Richard and Trent, this is very selfish to tax, but you can quickly build a sort of framework of actually, what are my answers in each of those areas for both the location they're from and where they're going to. Now, the good news with that is that I think it narrows down the clarity quite quickly in terms of, well, where they're coming from. US in this scenario, probably not much will change, because ultimately they're still on US payroll, they're still going to have to pay, we're assuming they're a US citizen or green card holder, so they'll have US taxation. So there's a requirement for the employer and the individual. But as Kay pointed out, the big issue, I think, is the PE risk, the permanent establishment risk in China. What are they doing whilst they're there? And again, just in recent experience of some of these sort of live examples that come up, but as Trent was saying, subject to activities, days, a lack of an entity, it's probably lower risk in China is what I've seen so far. That's not to say if the Chinese authorities may be looking at perhaps a different approach in the future. Certainly China, they have a monthly payroll system rather than an annual tax return. There is an annual filing, but typically it's monthly requirement. And certainly if you're looking at that sort of 183-day mark, anything underneath that, they're probably going to be okay on the basis there's no sort of entity there. But again, the devil's in the detail. So it's lower risk. If we assume the individual's a Chinese national as well, which I think we have done for immigration purposes, then again, there may be some local filing requirements for that individual because they are in China. So lots of ifs and ands and maybes, and depends on, and I think that's where you need to get to the next level of the detail is, what's it, the individual risk. But certainly from an employment perspective, corporate presence, what are they doing, how long are they there for, and then ultimately, does that need to have a payroll requirement? And I'm just going to touch on one last thing. Sorry, Trent, before you just jump in. The tracking piece, yeah, absolutely. Make sure you know or give an idea. You are the employer. I'm going to steal Trent's line from many weeks ago. Sorry, hopefully you won't going to use this, Trent, but you're the employer. So you could say, okay, you're there for 2 months and then you must return. And I think that's, from a tax perspective, that helps put in some clarity around, when do you move from low risk into a medium to high risk? So you can manage that. I'll shut up.
So that's David. That's a point I wanted to emphasize, and I'm glad you raised it. The key problem for me with this issue is that she says, I'd like to stay longer, but there's no end in sight, right? So the key point to this situation or scenario, if I'm the company, is coming up with that end in sight so that the place of employment taxation doesn't transfer. And when we think of short-term workers, I think our nearest sort of model should be business travelers. And the more we can treat them like somebody on a quick business trip, the better. And nobody goes on a business trip and says, I don't know when I'm coming back. So if she says, I want to stay longer, you better say you have to be back by X date.
Would you say, Trent, that would be before 6 months, or David?
Well, I was about to say that because that's a really important question, because you would say yes, but here's the challenge is that you might say you've got to be back within, let's say it's another 2 months, 3 months. So they stick within this, the 183 days, just because that's the industry sort of OECD model. But what stops that individual going back later on for personal reasons, a vacation? So that's where, it's not just your work days that count, it's your days of presence in that other location. So that includes everything you're doing, obviously your personal days and your work days. So Richard, great question. I think if there's any policy around this, it's got to be very clear that, what it is this means to spend time in another location. How many days do you have in total? And that might not be easy to do in a policy, but down to the specific case in point, you as the employer can probably say, you have this much time before we have to do something. And that's going to depend on the jurisdiction.
And so go ahead.
Yeah, and I've seen policies go as little as 2 weeks with this idea of business travel, right? You can stay up to 2 weeks. And if we don't have an entity there, forget it. Or 90 days, because you can often get a work visa for 90 days to be the business traveler in a lot of places, and that's your cutoff. But you're right, David, not all countries adhere to this 90 days on tax issues. You're probably relatively safe as long as you're not transferring the employment there on day one, which we'll talk about in an upcoming one. But yeah, there's a range you have to be comfortable with.
Yeah, I wish there was just a simple tick box, but there isn't. You're looking at domestic law, as you say, around what it is to be a taxable individual, an employee working, whatever, in that other location. The treaties are there to protect, and you can use those at the end of the day just to look at, trying to claim credits or exemptions. But ultimately, you have to abide by domestic law. That's where you're looking first. And I think that's why this is hard. This is a hard group, because it's just, where do you? And I often get asked, can you just give me a matrix? Give me a matrix of how this would work between two. And it's like, what are there, 180 something taxation countries that offer tax in the world? How many do you want me to focus on? And with all those different, scenarios. So it's very challenging, very challenging.
So the bottom line is, the shorter amount of time you are in a country, the lower the PE risk. Is there any sort of time? I guess it's all a gray area, right? In terms of what constitutes permanent establishment.
It depends on what they're doing. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, it depends what you do. The activities of the individual. I wouldn't just say, less time there, the less risk. I think it, depending on what that country determines as your employee's activity, which was representing the corporate, then that could create a PE or nexus issue, certainly for in the States as well.
All right.
Got to be checked out.
So I might offer that on that checklist, when you're trying to decide how much risk you're willing to take on, do I allow them 2 weeks? Do I allow them up to 90 days? Do I allow people to 120 days on sort of rare occasion? I think you're asking, what are they doing there? In other words, does what they do touch on the business locally? Is this a salesperson and he happens to be working inside his sales territory, just in a new place? That's different than somebody who works on a computer from HR and is only helping people back in the United States. The risks are different. You may be willing to go a longer time with the HR person than you would with the salesperson who's actually touching that market. And the country's involved. Is it a country with a really aggressive tax scheme or not, or a less aggressive employment scheme like China? You can, when you know what pieces are in your sort of pot, and these are the places I work on, it'll be much easier to come up with your risk tolerance and how long you're going to let people stay on average.
Now I have to jump in and ask Trent a real quick question. If this employee, let's say they're not US based per se, say they're based in the UK or somewhere where there is an actual employment contract, and say this same individual traveled to China in our example, would they be in breach possibly of that employment contract in the UK?
Okay, that is a terrific question, Kay. You've had this happen before. It's true. And, outside of the United States, every other country, I could say, almost most countries outside of the US do have written employment agreements. And by and large, those agreements set out the place of employment. Your place of employment is such and such street, London, UK. Now, the employee can't unilaterally change that, right? That would be a breach of the contract. I might allow them to go temporarily on a business trip to another place, especially if their contract provides for it. But when you're dealing with contracts, you do need to be more careful. It gives you a lot more leverage to say, no, your place of employment is the UK. But if you are going to allow them to work overseas, then it's an even greater reason to put all of that in writing, because you may actually be amending what's in their contract, and you'll need to take steps to do that legally.
Thank you, Trent.
Thank you.
Right. And now, last but not least, Richard, what are your thoughts on the Juan and Dallas situation, short term?
Thank you. I thought you forgot all about me.
I'm gonna have you start first with the next one. We'll make up for lost time.
Well, I don't need to go first, but first would be good. So here's what we look at on our side: 4 core benefits, and then the fringe benefits. The 4 core benefits is retirement, death benefits or death in service. Then we have disability, and then finally medical or health care, right? So 2 of those we can pretty much put aside for now. We're not really concerned about the retirement in this scenario. We're not really concerned about the death benefits, because that will pay. Should the person die, that still, I'm sure, the death benefits would apply wherever they're traveling around the world. And then we're left with two others, the disability and the medical. Now, as Kay said, it didn't sound like her medical plan would cover someone that would be traveling outside of the United States. And by the way, even if they do, if your plan, customer, client, prospect, does cover it, then you have to ask the question, to what degree, right? Then is it out of pocket? Sorry, not out of pocket, out of network? Likely so when you travel outside the United States or outside of the network, because not likely the US employer has a US plan that has a network in China. If you have an international plan, this person wouldn't really qualify on that because it's short-term travel. So we would suggest, if you're allowing the person to do this, that, which you've done, because it says allowed her to go to China, okay, which very specifically means that maybe, I hope, somebody's put some thought behind it and said, well, what if you get sick, or what if you become disabled, even what if you die, and therefore looked already at the medical plan in the United States and said, well, if you do go, that's fine, but it will only cover you for these kinds of services. And if you have other services, you're going to be out of pocket a hell of a lot of money. So I hope that's been done in advance. Now, having said all of that, and they say, yeah, you're going to be out of network, then you can also buy, and they're really inexpensive, these travel medical policies. And we recommend them really cheap. Even when you individually travel, all of us, probably a good idea to have one when you travel, super inexpensive. And they'll cover you for illness, the good ones will, for illness as well as accident. That's the medical side. On the disability side, let's assume the person becomes disabled, all right? Juan becomes disabled in China. And then you have an issue of, okay, how do we really know she's disabled? Then she's already saying she's challenged coming back to the United States, which, big question, what's that mean? Challenged to come back to the United States. So really it infers, at least the way I read it, and that's on my own personal reading, is that she didn't really want to come back. But let's assume she's there then and becomes disabled, is that it turns into a short-term disability, starts with that. All disability starts with short-term disability, and then it turns into a long-term disability. It becomes then if that happens, does she remain there and may not even be able to get back if she's really permanently and totally disabled? And then how are you going to pay that benefit in China from a U.S. benefit program that may not cover that person for long-term disability, just because it's in the contract. That might be in. By the way, all your contracts you should review. There's only 2 pages that matter in your insurance contracts: the limitations page and the exclusions page. Everything else is covered. Okay, that's in every insurance contract. So you look there, and it's very easy to look at those 2 pages and find out if your disability carrier is going to cover the person when they travel outside the U.S. Those are all issues that should be addressed in advance with Juan, the employee. Then the issue again of all those that we talked about coming back, I guess, re-engineering themselves to get back in the United States. But to me, all I'm hearing, I would say, there's no legal entity there. Okay, you can stay another couple of weeks, but you got to come back here because we're really putting us all at risk here. We love you, we want you, we enjoy the work you're doing here, but you need to come back in a couple of weeks. Otherwise, we have to have a serious conversation.
All right, thank you for that. And before we get to the next scenario, we're actually getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask a few of them right now to keep you on your toes. These are unprepared questions, so this is where we see how good our panelists really are. All right, so the first question is, what if there is a direct recharge of compensation to the host country entity?
Right, yeah, that's probably more of a, dare I say, a tax question. So Trent, over to you. No, I think, yeah, generally, if there's a recharge, that's a big red flag. So whether there's a treaty or not in place, that's something to really check. I mean, in our example, we didn't have a local entity, but if there is one there's a recharge. I'd say that's a taxable. You're basically pointing to that person working in that country. You should be paying tax and looking at maybe some sort of payroll or withholding, some sort of annual filing, and then there's corporate tax issues as well.
Right. To that point, that's also pretty good evidence that the individual is working there. So when we talk about place of employment, remember, if I hire somebody to work in Milwaukee at my plant, then from day one, their place of employment is Milwaukee. If I hire somebody who lives in China and I need them to work on a project for me, on day one, they're covered by Chinese employment law. So in this case, where we're doing a recharge, it really is going to look like that individual is engaged by the Chinese entity. What does that mean for you? It means restrictions on termination only for cause. So when you say time to come back to the US or you're fired, she says, you can't fire me. That's not cause under Chinese law. It means if you do fire her, you give her severance. It means she's entitled to 300% pay for accrued but unused annual leave if you do fire her, and a host of other issues that come up. So these are issues that would be triggered by that sharing of costs that we need to be sure have been addressed.
And so just to jump in very quickly, because I know you want to move on. Sorry, Social Security. Let's not forget Social Security as well. There's no agreement if we use our example, US to China. So again, you could have double Social Security issues, withholding issues for that individual. So all these little things to look into and check.
Good question.
Okay, devil's in the details as usual, right? All right, the next question for the panel. All of the things to think about, tax, employment law, immigration, are great, but what are companies doing about benefits? I think this is a plant for you, Richard. And in the event there is an accident of some sort, how much liability is there from an employer perspective?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the end of the question.
How much liability is there from an employer perspective in the event that there is some sort of accident?
Well, if the employer's clear, as I was saying earlier, with the employee when they're leaving, prior to leaving, what the benefit programs will cover. By the way, that's not even necessary because it's very specific. It's in the plans when they get them and they roll. This is the benefit plan and this is what it will cover. And please read the provisions in your employee handbook and even look at the policy if you like to. So the employer has very little liability. In cases like this, though, what we've seen in reality, because even though there isn't, and it might even be more of a Trent question, actually, of liability. It's not for me to say what liability is or is not. It's a legal question. But the employers often will put themselves out a little further in this situation and circumstances we are in now. They will make exceptions, and nobody really knows about them because they don't want it to be policy. But they do make exceptions for employees under these circumstances.
Yeah, and in the short term, I'd say that there really is little case law on a situation like this. I think that somebody injured, I'll say if they're a self-directed nomad, right? A self-directed remote worker, meaning I'm working here for personal reasons on a very short period of time, and I get injured while I'm there, they're going to be treated more like the person who's there on vacation in terms of employer liability. So now it does come up, we had a situation where somebody was traveling and they, on their way to the, they worked in Japan and on their way to the airport in UAE, they got hit by a car, unfortunately. And then the question became, I've been in the UAE for 2 or 3 months. Do I have any obligations here? But the Japanese insurer denied it because they didn't cover international claims. So then the employer was stuck with trying to, as a sort of good employer, sort of, we want to help our employees. Now they're paying this guy's UAE medical bills because the insurer wouldn't pay it. Do they have to do that? Maybe not. Is it the right thing to do if he was there on business? Yeah, and they didn't have sufficient insurance coverage? Yeah, probably the right thing to do. But by and large, liabilities, the answer is it depends. But there's not a lot of case law that's going to hold a short-term worker, the employer of a short-term worker temporarily overseas liable other than what they would normally be liable for under their home country rules.
Now, there was a case for even me personally. I was in China. I was sick, and I had to go to a Chinese hospital. And I didn't expect anything other than the U.S. care system, and was not like that at all. Okay, it was scary, in fact, for me. And I needed to get out of there, and I needed to get back to the United States to get the kind of care I was used to getting. That may happen in this case too, even though it sounds like she's from there. The care in the United States is still much greater benefit to the employee. Now, what happened to me, and two, the employer paid for my trip to fly back to get care in the United States because I was honestly a valued employee, and they wanted to go out of their way to help me. And it really helped me too, bind myself with the employer, the loyalty bond that you have with the employer that we just don't get enough anymore. So those are scenarios that can happen, because that happened to me in Xi'an, China, actually, which is a little bit even more remote than any of the major cities.
Yeah, it's an interesting issue because, you know, you think about somebody who says, I went to China and then I got, you know, I had to sit on my bed, and so I developed all kinds of ergonomic issues, so I'm suing under the workers' comp laws. It becomes a really challenging thing to do that internationally. Likely not, China's not going to cover it, and then what happens in the US. So anyway.
A question for Richard or Trent on this similar topic though. What if the employee just left on their own fruition and the employer did not give their consent up front that they could go to China and could perform actual productive work? Is there a fine line in that for insurance and or legalities?
Well, first, that happens all the time.
Right.
And employees don't want to tell their employer where they are, even when they're at home or not at work, when they're supposed to be in the office, right? In the same city. So is there increased complications? I don't know, probably not, other than, like I said earlier, I hope the HR department is able to prep a person before they travel. If not, it's still their responsibility, and they're adults. And if they leave to a country, those are consequences they'll have to accept afterwards, that's my view.
Okay.
That's right.
All right, I got one more question, and then we'll go back to our prepared scenarios here. This is from one of our audience members. We created an approve, deny cross-border corporate tax matrix based on where we have legal entities, and then a blanket denial for any request to work remotely where there is no legal entity present unless extenuated circumstances. So what were your
My hero.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's a great place to start. That's a really good way of. A lot of companies that I've been talking to are looking at exactly that sort of focus point. You know, limiting it to where they work.
Yeah, sorry, where they have entities. Yeah, absolutely. And I see that more and more. We allow it if we have a local entity there. But often this comes in play, these rules really come in play in the short term, in the longer term where they're going to be there more than a few weeks, right? So then the question on the short term is, if they're going to be there less than a month, does it still apply? I'm going to go home for 3 or 4 weeks. You know, maybe that's some of the gray area where the policy will need to address that versus the longer term where something like this absolutely makes the most sense.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, Trent, I've seen probably similar to yourself, 30 days, as you know, most have chosen that sort of 30 days as a sort of threshold before really there's a lot of focus on doing the right thing. Some are pushed to 60, some rarely 90 or 120, and then occasionally, you know, 180 plus, you know, that sort of thing, which I think is very aggressive. But yeah, there seems, I think this is the point, you know, you can set those thresholds, look at your own risk profile within that. So.
All right. Okay, now I'm going to go into our next scenario here. Jenny is based in Ireland, where she works from her home office for the Irish entity. She contacts Global Mobility and asks whether she can go to Sri Lanka, where her in-laws live. Jenny's pregnant and has a due date in 5 months. She wants to be close to her husband's family during pregnancy. Richard, you want to take that one first, or you want me to go to Trent?
Oh, whatever you like, that's fine. I'll start, maybe I'll come back. Jenny, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Okay, you can't go running around the world. You're 5 months pregnant, and you're going to go to Sri Lanka, and you expect to deliver a baby the same you would in the. It's nice to be around family. Have them visit you. Okay, that would be my first bit of advice. In fact, we have this consulting manual we refer to all the time, and when I get these tough questions, this is what I try to refer to here. All right, worldly wisdom. It's pretty simple. Okay, this is what the consulting business is all about. Now, practically though, she wants to go and she's a good employee and you want to keep her and you want the bond, employer bond, then you got to ask the question whether the medical coverage, because we're not going to even get into, well, it could turn into disability, but really medical coverage will cover in Sri Lanka. It's Ireland, not likely. You have to put on a travel medical policy. Probably for sure will not cover pregnancy outside of Ireland. So I would stay home, Jenny. Jenny, stay home. Go visit after the baby's born.
All right. Trent, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to know what Kay's going to say.
All right.
My first question is, do we have an entity in Sri Lanka? So that's the first red flag that comes up. And definitely tying into what Richard said, does her current medical insurance cover her in Sri Lanka? And definitely talking to HR and her manager about really, should she go at this point? Is it really in her best interest as an employee to travel at that point in time? So a lot of different things to look at.
Oh, by the way, important point here too at maternity, which we very often miss. In the United States, and remember when the law passed, because I've been doing this for so long, it's considered same as any other illness or disability, right? And of course, it's not an illness or disability, but it's a medical procedure, going in the hospital, having a baby. But that's not the case in most countries around the world. Maternity is an add-on cover. So in Sri Lanka, it may not even provide it in the local entity's benefit program, because I like it's a joke and people don't like it necessarily, but it's a self-inflicted injury, maternity is, right? So it qualifies as an injury, an illness in the United States, but doesn't necessarily do so around the world. Okay, that's my 2 cents.
All right. David, we had a panelist that tacked onto this question, a tax question, so I'm going to read it to you.
Yeah, I saw.
Oh, you saw it. So will Jenny have to pay Social Security taxes in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're getting down to that. It depends. I mean, there's so many things around it. So first of all, it's likely that she'll retain Irish residence, tax residence, etc. So she not necessarily going to break the Irish side of things. There are no agreements between Ireland and Sri Lanka, either tax treaty or Social Security. So again, immediately you start thinking, well, there could be some issues in Sri Lanka. So then I would start going back to, well, as everyone was saying, how long is she going to go there for, and really, what is she going to be doing? Is this just an extended sort of holiday? And I'm just throwing scenarios out, really. Is she truly going to be working in all that period? Is it a period of work and then sort of maternity leave or taking vacation or whatever it's going to be? So you need to look at all of those factors, but there's probably a risk that there is some sort of tax and Social Security due if she is actually physically working in that period. Again, how long is she there for? There's all these sort of different scenarios that come into play around that sort of that answer. So yeah, an interesting one. Go for it, Trent.
I'd say, first of all, this is a true story, though we changed their identities. And it was Sri Lanka, and she's still there. But it is me. If you call me before it happens, I'm with Richard. The answer is, oh, heck no. Unless you want to leave now and go on an unpaid leave of absence, right? And not work. Just don't do any work in Sri Lanka, and maybe you'll still qualify for our company provided maternity leave benefit. But here's the problem. If she goes now at 5 months, she works for 4 months in Sri Lanka or elsewhere. Remember that many countries around the globe have 3-month waiting periods before you're eligible for maternity leave protection. And maternity leave protections in other countries is often way more protective than what we have in the United States. So And I've seen it. Go to France, be there a little while, not really telling our employer what their plans are, and then they go to the French authorities and claim maternity protection or maternity leave, right? And now the employer's like, oh crap, I haven't been paying into the French system. And now what do I do, right? It's a huge mess because because maternity is such a protected area. And in fact, in a lot of countries, you can't fire anybody who's pregnant, period. It doesn't matter what you do. So if you do try to fire her, the judges are like, what's wrong with you, you big jerk? She's pregnant. You've got to help her, right? And then they reinstate the poor woman with all kinds of emotional distress damages. So when we're dealing with, okay, not really emotional distress, I exaggerated that piece, but they'll put her back with some sort of support. So anyway, this is a very touchy issue because it really is something that I, as an employer, I'd be like, woo, risks everywhere.
And that's why if I get that request in mobility, I immediately engage in the HR person and say, we need to bring you in on that one.
And Richard, we just got another question that kind of, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment, but it ties into this, I believe. Some insurance companies consider remote working as, not insurance company, but some insurance considers remote working as a business trip because it is an approved work arrangement. However, the family is not.
Yeah, that's Rebecca or Diana from my office.
Thanks, Rebecca and Diana.
So,
all right, so we have, and here's a question also that tacks onto that. No, we just got another one. So this is a tax question. Does employer or corporate tax advice change if she is on paid leave while in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so I was reading the one above that, which is all about Australian FPT, but I can come back to that one in a minute. So yeah, look, if it's paid leave, I mean, that's no different from really any, I think initially my reaction would be they're on vacation. It's like you can go on holiday anywhere, regardless of your, whether you're pregnant or not. So I don't think there's a tremendous amount there of employer or corporate tax risk. But if there was, staying on beyond that, maybe interaction with the local office, I think to Trent's point, this is where you start, there's alarm bells start to ring around, where could this go? And just a bit of scenario, planning probably is best for this sort of arrangement. And I think it goes back to an approval process. Do you allow this? Do you as a business want to allow this type of arrangement to exist? If they're there on paid leave, I would say they're there on their own volition, not for the business.
All right.
The one above that, just very quickly, Steve, just say.
You want to read it for me? So everybody knows.
Of course, the timing. So I'm going to say there's lots of things changing. I think a lot of countries have been looking at business travelers anyway. Sorry, Steve.
Oh yeah, people need to know what the question is because they're not.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, good point.
I'm
not going to tell you. It's a game of Jeopardy, Steve. I'm going to give the answer. You give the question. So this is around countries changing tax laws and around business travel, short-term, remote working, that sort of thing. What do we think of the future trends? Just very, very quickly, yes, I think if they haven't already, they will be doing so because this is an area of revenue. The direction of travel, no pun intended, has been to tax business travelers, short-term workers in other locations, in a country they are just spending a week, a month, cumulatively or consecutively. This is a big area of risk, and it's increasing.
All right, and just so you know, it's okay if we go a little bit over, so we don't just stop right at the end of the mark. A few minutes over is fine. And if folks have to hop off early, we are recording this, and anybody that registered, we will send you that.
I have to take care of the baby, though.
We won't go that far over.
All right, baby can wait.
Baby can wait. Got lots of years ahead of her waiting. All right, so next scenario is your human resource team is putting together a short-term policy. They ask for your input. What items do you think are absolutely need to be in that policy? Maybe I'll start with Kay.
I knew you were coming to me, Steve. If we're looking and just at short-term remote worker, definitely where our current company locations are. So again, the whole permanent establishment thing, insurance coverage, immigration that may be needed potentially, but also I think importantly, what's that risk tolerance? So it's at 30 days, 90 days, 60 days, whatever it is, we would need to agree as a company moving forward what that definitive timeline is. So I think because of COVID, it's been all over the board and companies have tried to address it the best way possible, again, fitting in their culture and their philosophy. So those would be my key things.
Anybody have anything they want to add to that?
Well, I put what is in your policy, what the employee would be responsible for very clearly. In the benefits arena, that would be responsible for reviewing their handbooks, the benefit programs, and determining whether they apply or not apply and where they're going.
Yeah, and for me, in addition, go
ahead.
ahead, David.
Trent, go.
Go.
I'll go.
I would say that in addition to your standard definitions of who's eligible for short-term work like this, because not every position is eligible for it, right? Setting out who's eligible, setting out limitations on time. But in addition, I think a crucial part of that policy needs to include your application, your process for approving those, how much discretion are you giving to the managers to do it, and then how you're putting that in writing. When you have somebody agreeing to go, and I'm talking more than 2 or 3 weeks, right? We're talking a couple of months now at this point, or at least more than your 30 days. You might even do this for those who are at the 30-day mark. You're going to want to be sure that you have emphasized where the place of employment is in that letter. You want to be sure that letter sets out your place of employment is Houston, Texas, London, England, wherever it is. That they're doing, if it's at their request, which this is what this program is about, that you're doing them a favor, that doesn't change their place of employment. It also needs to include a return date, a statement that if they don't return by that certain date, if you're in the US especially, that they'll be deemed to have resigned from their position, right? All of these things that really emphasize that the place of employment is home, not foreign, I think goes a long way to protecting the company from a lot of these time periods. You may also require them to use vacation days, because as we were talking about earlier, for purposes of employment and even tax, right? If they're not working in country, then it doesn't really count. Okay, tax is still, it's being in country, but for purposes of employment, if they're not working in the country, their place of employment hasn't changed. So if I say you need to use that, you're going to be gone 60 days, you have 20 days of PTO, you've got to use all your PTO while you're there. Now they only have a little over 30 days that they're actually working in country, and that also is a benefit to the company. So think about how you're going to use your leave and the extent to which you may require it as a condition of granting this overseas work.
Yeah, and not to dwell on, because I think that's great. Everyone's given great advice around how I'd approach it as well. I think there's some core questions to ask right at the beginning. Entity, I've got day thresholds, what you're responsible for, when you've got to return by, all of those sort of comments. And then I think the secondary area is, well, once you've established what those are and what your responses are, how do they impact the sort of key areas, like, for my world, tax, so payroll, social security, what's the requirement of the individual to file tax returns, and you get all into they're sort of the outcomes of the decisions that are being made on where how many days you're going to allow someone to stay in that other country. So I suppose there's, what's the word I put it? So there's consequences for your decisions, and those, what are those actions and how do they impact your other departments? And I think getting together, you can't do this just in isolation of your policy of just saying it's just an HR issue. There are other departments within your organization that have to be brought into this discussion, because these decisions are going to impact their operations and the risks that they have. So yeah, there's a lot more to unpack on this than just questions. Simple questions can be answered, but the impact can be huge in certain areas. I'll just give you one example: payroll. With these short-term, long or extended business trips, if you want to call them that, or remote working for a series of months, you may have dual payroll requirements. Well, that's an additional cost, and then you've got dual withholding potentially. Who's going to cover that? Is the employee suddenly going to have to pay have withholding on twice? There's all these sort of questions around how that operates. It might even be the difference between someone doing it and not. So it's those sort of scenarios.
All right, we got a couple more questions we'll try and get through, and then we'll wrap things up. These are from the audience. This first one is a Singapore question, Trent. Hello, we have a location in Singapore, and it seems Singapore allows to hire people in other countries if they are working for a Singapore company. What are the risks for the employer with employees working in Romania, for example, but being hired from Singapore? And will a benefits policy in Singapore cover employees in other locations?
Hey, that's a great question. The truth is, the U.S. allows you can hire anybody in a foreign country in most locations. But the issues that we're talking about today apply equally to anybody who has engaged a worker outside of the company's home location. And what that means is, as soon as I, company A, wherever I'm located, engage a worker in country B, I now have to figure out compliance with country B's rules. Singapore's laws won't apply to that person in country B. They don't. Romania law does. And that's for everything, from an establishment, tax, payroll, employment. If I'm sitting in Singapore, which I am, and I know that I can fire somebody for any reason and give them notice of 30 days or pay in lieu, and I try to fire that person in Romania, that Romania person's going to say, well, wait, in Romania, you can't fire me without cause, and I'm going to go to the labor authorities and I'm going to stop the termination process, or you've got to give me these other things that I'm entitled to under Romanian law because this is where you hired me from. So it doesn't really matter it doesn't matter where the employer is, it matters where the employee was hired to work. That's the law that applies. So that's where you in a multinational company now need to think, can I be compliant with these rules if I've engaged that worker over there? So that's when you start thinking PEO, that's when you start thinking independent contractor, some of these alternatives to engaging workers where compliance becomes too challenging.
Yeah, the same applies in benefits. You need a foundation in order to attach to for the benefit program. And it would be the local employee, wherever they're working from. As long as they're not considered expatriate, where you hired them originally, in the case in Singapore, and then moved them to Romania. And then an expatriate program, benefit program would apply then.
Yeah, I agree with, from a very simple, you're withholding from a tax perspective, where that employee is in Romania, that's where they should pay. I think the questions that go through my mind of this one are more sort of corporate tax related is, and again, I suppose it depends on, are you directly hiring or is someone moving there? You've got things like, where do the costs sit for this individual? Is that going to sit with the local entity? Is it still back with the US entity? So there's corporate tax, transfer pricing issues there straight away, which need to be addressed. Again, what is the individual doing? What activities are, they're representing where was it, Singapore, wasn't it? Sorry. Are they representing the Singapore company whilst they're in that other country? And what does that mean within Romania? How do they feel about that from their domestic laws? So a lot of corporate tax, presence, what you're doing, and recharging of any costs potentially, or even revenue. So it's not even just a cost perspective, it's what is that individual doing, on behalf of the Singapore business. So yeah, lots to unpack there.
All right, I'm going to push for luck here and ask one more question and then close it out, okay? You guys write this down a little bit longer?
Well, it depends what the question is.
Well, here it is. If the employee is working remotely temporarily and the company has a legal entity there, can they work at a desk in the local entity, or must they work elsewhere? like the family home or temporary residence.
Who do you want to take that one?
Yeah, my view is the more connection you give to the local entity, the more likely, the more the risk that you give to the local entity as being deemed their local employer. So I tend to say if they're choosing to work remotely for personal reasons, then they need to stay remote in their personal place, wherever that is. Unless you want to do it long term and risk transferring employment to the local employer, which you could do long term.
I'd agree with Trent there, just very quickly. Some countries have the economic employer argument, which again looks at connectivity and integration into the local business. And I think, you know, those are, again, flags for that sort of argument being applied to say you're integrated into the local business. You know, so therefore there's a tax issue. I think, yeah, local visits in, maybe, you know, say hello, that's fine. But actually going in to work, yeah, I would question whether that's a wise decision.
Okay, then.
Keeping in mind, you know, think of the difference between the business traveler who's there 2 weeks and happens to work in the office while she's there versus somebody who's going to be there a few months. It's a different feel. That's all I got.
Well, all right. Well, that brings us to 2 minutes past the hour. I think we did excellent on time. I want to give a huge thank you to Richard Polak, David Levitt, Kay Kolakowski, and Trent Sutton. Wonderful panel discussion. Thank you to the audience participation. We had a lot of great questions. Thank you to our sponsors, who are Mortgage and Quicken Loans. We will be coming out with our white paper shortly based on our first webinar, the long-term remote workers. And then we hope to follow up with that with a white paper on the short-term remote workers. And as a reminder, tons and tons of great information is on our website under the gtn.com resources tab. This webinar will be available there for download probably tomorrow, maybe even later today, as well as a whole slew of other great information. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Great,
Bye all.
great seeing you all. Thank you. Thanks, Kay. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks, Steve. You did great, Steve.